today. Excited. This is one of my all-time favorite parashas. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to those of you just joining us on Facebook. On YouTube. This week is Parashath Lech, and we're happy you joined us. Let's get some technical grammatical issues and meaning of the words out of the way before we talk about the big picture ideas. First of all, Abraham was bidden by God to leave me'artzecha umi moladtecha umi beit avicha, from your land, from your moledet, and from your father's house. In modern Hebrew, they were looking for a word meaning homeland. As a matter of fact, at the very beginning of when it actually became a practical idea that the Jewish people had found a state in the land of Israel, they needed a word for homeland. National self-determination was a big thing back then, and every nation had its homeland, and they needed a new Hebrew vocabulary for obvious purposes, and they chose the word moledet to mean homeland. It's kind of interesting here. Abraham was bidden to leave his land, and then he has to leave his father's house. Father's house we see as a reference to family, and his land is where he came from. So what's moledet? So they seized upon this word. They said it means a homeland. But then there's a little bit of redundancy. In classical rabbinic understanding, moledet is from the word birth. The shorish is yud or vav, lamed daled. And elsewhere in the Bible, moledet actually means where someone is born. It refers to the more general family. As a matter of fact, we see later in the Torah that being part of a tribe and being part of a family and then being part of a father's house are all very specific terms for different groups within the national entity. That is, for example, every Jew who would enter the land of Israel with Joshua had an official affiliation with a tribe and with a family within that tribe and with the father's house, and because they're organized as a conquering army, also with a certain group called an Elef and a Meyah and an Asara, meaning a group of 1,000 and a group composed of 100 and a group composed of 10. Everybody knew exactly where they were in this structure. Moledet does not mean homeland in the Bible, certainly not in this week's Parashah, even though many are taught that it is. It refers to the more general family, and Beit Avicha refers to the more specific family. And this actually makes sense because it says that when Terach departed Ur Kasdim for Haran, he basically took Abraham and the surviving grandchildren from Haran, and also it turns out later we read that he even took Nahor and Nahor's fledgling family. Nahor was Abraham's brother. So it makes sense now that Abraham was bidden first to leave his moledet. That refers to the family members, let's say his brother, and perhaps other nieces and nephews that he may have. And then Beit Avicha is even the closer relatives, just those in his father's house. And if you look this up, you'll see that that's correct. Another thing that they point out is already twice in this week's Parsha, we have synonyms for the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. In the olden days, it appears that they used to orient their maps, if they had, or even just direction telling, by facing eastward. And that makes sense because when one begins his travels, the easiest direction to find is east, because that's where the sun is. And that's how people oriented themselves. That's also why, for example, in classic English, the Orient is a word for the east. The Occident is the west, and the Orient is the east. That's how you orient yourself. And if one were therefore facing eastward, to his left is north, and to his right is south. And indeed, that's what it means when Abraham chased these Mesopotamian warlords and their hordes back to where they came from. It says, Misamol Damasek, he got all the way to the left of Damascus, which means north of Damascus. Also, in the Parsha right before that, Abraham offers Lot, you go left, I'll go right, you go right, I go left. And it's been pointed out, Onkelos in that situation translates those as, north and south. You go north, I'll go south, you go south, I'll go north. And he was giving that as an example. It turns out they divide up east-west. And that brings us to our next point. And this is something that Onkelos because he happened to have lived in the land of Israel, has an advantage, aside from the fact that he was closer to when it happened and had better traditions. It often has many advantages over the classical medieval commentators and authorities who, unfortunately, did not actually visit the land of Israel and have firsthand knowledge of certain geographical truths. What am I referring to? It says that Lot looked around and he saw what used to be called Kikar HaYarden in the area that is now the Dead Sea. It used to be a much nicer place, and there were much greater civilizations there, the 5 cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, etc., which were quite wealthy, and apparently the place there used to be very nice back in the day before they were destroyed for their sins, of course. And it says, Vayisalot Mikedem. Vayisalot Mikedem. He went from the east. And, for example, you could look in the classical commentators, they seem to say that Lot went westward, because if one's coming from the east, it means he went westward. Kedem often does mean east, and Kedma means to the east. So if he's coming from the east, it means he went west. So Abraham went east. The problem is that it doesn't seem to be the case. If you look on the map, if Abraham was anywhere along the route that it says that scribes have used to take, especially somewhere south of Shechem, near the Ai, Beit El, and places like that, and eventually it says he went to Hebron, these all basically form a north-south axis on what is today Route 60 through Judea and Samaria. And Lot actually went southeast of Abraham towards the Dead Sea. So it means he went eastward. And Onkelos, like in another situation, Onkelos here says Mikedem means he was the first one to pick up and go. Abraham had offered, we'll split up. He said that, we'll split up. Usually when you split up, you have 2 people start at the same point. They go separate at the same time. And here it's indicating that actually Lot was the one who picked up and left, whenever direction he went. And it was only later, sometime, perhaps even just a few days, but whatever it was, Abraham actually stayed put for a while, and then he left. So Mikedem means earlier. That's how Onkelos happens to translate this Mikedem right there on the page. He says Milakadmin. Milakadmin means beforehand or earlier. And some translations I've seen say Milakadmeta, which is similar in meaning. It's also Aramaic for beforehand. That means he went first. And now I discovered also that in the translation, Onkelos' translation to Bereshit, in the second chapter of Genesis, we're already a few chapters into Genesis, when it says Gan be'Eden Mikedem, where God planted a garden in Eden, Mikedem, which apparently means out in the east, or towards the east, or from the east. By the way, it's directional indicating east, and that's what Kedem seems to mean. That's the way many Mefarshim have it. Chevelle, Rabbi Chevelle, who happens to have translated many works of Nachmanides and also Rabbeinu Bachye, among others, was also working for Mossad Rav Kook, and he was the one who did the editing and the annotating of Rashi's commentary and Nachmanides' commentary and others for Mossad Rav Kook edition of the Torah. It's not behind me. It's over there on the bookshelf. You can't see. And there he points out that even though when it describes the location of the Garden of Eden, once again, it says Mikedem. Rashi uses this as a directional, indicating where it would be. Onkelos, once again, translates this Mikedem not in terms of space, but in terms of time. It means once upon a time, God planted this garden. And so this is a good resolution to a problem that you can find among many Mefarshim, many commentators on the page. If they're trying to figure out what it means that Lot went Mikedem from the east, no, it doesn't mean from the east. It means he went beforehand. Onkelos' explanation fits with the reality and also seems to be authoritative in this regard. Okay, now earlier this year I put out the Haggadah Pesach. You could go look back and see in previous videos what that was about. And there, one of the central themes that I address is the idea of what we're accomplishing by bringing the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach is interesting because the sages link it to the history of the patriarchs. They like to say that through textual clues, it seems that Abraham himself was circumcised just a few days before what would have been Passover, and it was on Erev Pesach that the angels came to visit him and told him about, once again, that Isaac would be born. And that night was the night Sodom was overturned, and there's also allusions in the text. It says, for example, Lot was baking the matzahs. Why does it mention that? It must be it was Passover. So Sodom was overturned the night of Passover, apparently sometime around midnight or early in the morning, apparently. Whatever it was, just like Lot, as the morning approached, was seized by the angels and was removed from there, and that's what saved his life. So too, the Jewish people also went out of Egypt early in the morning on the 15th of Nisan, and the sages point out there's these things repeat themselves. That day is marked, and the special power that the day has is what it is. And the Jewish people later, 40 years afterwards, when they got to the land, also had a mass circumcision in the days preceding that Passover. They crossed the Jordan River the first week of Nisan. The second week. On the 6th of Nisan, or the 7th, whatever it is, a month after Moses was dead, they finished their mourning period, and in rapid succession, they had 7 days to cross the Jordan River and get ready to keep their first Passover. And there was a mass circumcision in the wake of those events, and then they had their first Passover. So you see, there's a connection similar to what happened 40 years before that, where in preparation for the very first Passover, the night of the Exodus, they were also told that they had to get ready. Those who were uncircumcised had to do so that they could partake of the korban, of the offering. Now, they also explain, by the way, this is in the Torah, it explains, it's in the book of Joshua, why it is that so many people had to be circumcised. Haven't Jews always practiced circumcision? The answer is no. Apparently, while they were wandering in the wilderness, they refrained from doing so for whatever reason they had. And there was a whole generation of people who had to be circumcised in advance of this Passover, the first one in the land. So too, in Egypt, apparently, there were many people who were not circumcised. It was Shevet Levi, they say. They're the only ones who were practicing it, according to this understanding. All the other tribes had to make sure that they were circumcised in order to do this. So we see there's a major connection here between the sacrificial service and circumcision and the Passover, and believe it or not, also the gift of getting the land. Twice in this week's Parasha, we see that God struck a covenant with Abraham to give him the land of Canaan. By the way, I like to say Canaan has many meanings to it. Most basically, Canaan is the eponymous person who gave the name, his own name to the land. He's the ancestor, the legendary ancestor of all the Canaanite peoples. And he was one cursed to be a slave to his older brothers. Canaan, the Shoresh in Hebrew, the root word means one who's surrendering, or lowly, or someone who's resigned to others. And this is an idea that Canaan would end up being a slave. The land of Israel was still called the land of Canaan even after the conquest, because it's actually it's about humility. A person who has the characteristics of hachna'ah, submission. That's actually considered one of the good things. It's similar to humility and modesty. So the land of Israel is called that because it's the place for good midot, like in this case, this particular midah of submission. Also, it refers to the lowness. The eastern side of the land, the Jordan Valley, is basically one of the lowest places on earth, especially in the ancient world. As a matter of fact, people know that the Dead Sea is the lowest place on earth, and the rest of the Jordan Valley is actually quite low, despite the fact that it's not as low as the Dead Sea. The Kinneret, which is the northernmost part of the valley, is still hundreds of meters below sea level. And that's what the spies told Moses when they finished their tour of the land. They said the Amorites live in the mountains, but the Canaanites, their father group, the father category, the father tribe, they live on the coast, which is always low, and along the Jordan River, which is, as I said, some of the lowest places on earth. So that's why it's called Canaan. Now, Abraham made a covenant with God. It says the covenant between the parts. He asked, how do you know that he would inherit the land? And God told him, well, go get me these types of animals. And he basically told him, take one of each of the animals that would be brought in the temple. The 5 species of animal are brought in the temple: bovine, sheep, goats, turtle doves, and pigeons. And that's exactly what God told him to do. And the sages say, God was saying, it's in the merit of the sacrificial service that the people of Israel would control the land, inherit the land, and give it over to their children. And later, some almost apparently 13 years later, or 14 or 24 years later, however the chronology goes, Abraham once again entered a covenant with God, but this time over circumcision. He would get the land if his children keep this covenant of circumcision. And they're combined. This was, like I said, the circumcision happened only a few days before this primordial Passover, which was taking place the night Sodom was overturned. And that is why, hundreds of years later, when it came time to leave Egypt, the Jewish people once again had to fulfill these two commandments. They had to somehow get all themselves circumcised and participate in a communal and universal sacrificial service, which would be the Korban Pesach, as was done in Egypt. And that would give them the merit to escape Egypt and begin their journey back to the Promised Land. So too, when they finally got there, after some difficulties along the way, really it shouldn't have taken 40 years, but whatever it was, when they finally got there at the end of those 40 years, so they began once again, how will they merit the land? What do they have to do? Which commandments do they have to keep? They have to keep circumcision and the sacrificial ritual. And that's why the major story at the beginning of Joshua is they all circumcised themselves, and then as soon as they could, when the time came, they performed this major sacrificial service, which is the Korban Pesach, which explains also why, among all the positive commandments, these two are actually punishable by excision, kareth, as the sages call it, and as it's referred to in the Torah. Normally, kareth is a penalty reserved for someone who violates certain negative commandments. The negative commandments have actually a hierarchy of punishment. Some, unfortunately, carry certain death penalties, and even among the death penalties, there's a hierarchy of what's a more severe penalty. And after that, there's lashes administered for certain prohibitions, and for certain other prohibitions, there is no physical punishment. Sometimes there's a fine. There's remedies for those who are unwitting. Even sometimes certain punishments require some sort of sacrificial atonement. Between the death penalties and the lashes, there's the punishment of kareth, excision. And actually the Tractate of Karethot, which those studying Daf Yomi recently finished studying, they see that it starts with a list of the following unwitting sins a person would be liable to excision. And then it mentions, and for neglecting two positive commandments, those two positive commandments being the circumcision and the Korban Pesach. Well, a person could claim, well, hold on just 1 second. I couldn't bring the Korban Pesach because I was stuck somewhere. I was prevented by the government or whoever. Or I could not circumcise myself because circumcision is performed on an 8-day-old baby, and I really couldn't be held responsible for something that did not happen to me when I was an 8-year-old. And the answer is indeed no. A person is only considered fully liable once he's an adult, and he still persists in this state of not having himself circumcised. So too, the punishment of kareth for one who neglected to bring Korban Pesach is only someone who it doesn't have an excuse, someone who's at fault for not bringing this. Be that as it may, we could ask this question: why is it that these two commandments, positive commandments, would carry a penalty of kareth? And the answer is that these two mitzvot, these two commandments, are actually the basis for the Jewish identity. Rabbi Soloveitchik has an essay about this. Rabbi Ziegler recently posted this also after I put out the Haggadah. Now the English version's on the way, so now I mentioned what he says here. Rabbi Soloveitchik saw circumcision as the identifier, what makes someone part of the community. So too, Korban Pesach has this, among all the other sacrifices, this is the one that identifies one as Jewish. I wrote in Haggadah, it's because all the other sacrifices, technically speaking, a person could avoid. A man never has to bring any sacrifice if he just stays away from the temple, although he should not. But even then, we're only talking about adult men, whereas Korban Pesach somehow involves even, for example, those slaves who are born Gentile and are not fully converted, or women who normally are exempt from all the other sacrifices during the pilgrimages. And also, a person has to involve his children, even if though they're not adults and they don't have to come attend the Korban Pesach. Still, it's a man's commandment that as he is partaking of the bitter herbs and the matzah and the Korban Pesach, that he tell his children what this is all about. That's I would believe is the main part of this entire commandment. And it's okay. And And there you have it. That's why we have these two fundamental commandments in this week's Parsha. Abraham is promised the land, and it's basically setting the stage for what will be when the Torah is given. Just one other note, it says explicitly in Tractate Chulin that we keep the mitzvot today because they are given at Sinai, not because they're given to Adam or to Noah or to Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. The Torah was re-given or given from anew with Moses. So we keep circumcision and Korban Pesach and any other sacrifices because it says so in the Torah. But what happened with Abraham was setting the stage, a major foreshadowing, if you will. Thank you all for joining us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, questions and comments, share the video with friends, and we'll see you next time.